Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm Cadell Last, and I'm here with Professor of Theology, or should I say Chair of Theology at GCAS, the Global Center for Advanced Studies.
Yeah.
Barry Taylor's work focuses at the intersection between religion, theology, and culture, with a particular emphasis on the impact of the interplay of contemporary digital life between religion and belief, and specifically related to Western Christianity. And we're here today to discuss his book, Sex, God, and Rock and Roll, which is a particularly provocative title. But I was gonna say to start off, this seems to be a direct play on the counterculture axiom, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Of course, you do
Yeah.
get to sex, drugs, and rock and roll as well.
Yeah.
I want to sort of start off by saying what was the inspiration for this title, and how did the book come about?
Well, to be truthful, the title was not my choice, and I was actually very resistant to it because I thought it sounded too predictable, and I didn't think there was that much rock and roll in it, And I had a different title, but it was too much for them. So
Do you want to keep that title a secret, or
no, no,
could we?
no, no, no. Well, you've read the book, and so you know what the first chapter is, which is it's called Comfort. But what I originally my sort of what because when I discussed with the editor, what the book was going to be about, I just sort of flippantly said, well, sex, God, rock and roll, but I wanted to call it fucking comfort because well, you've read the first chapter, so you know the connection with that. But I just thought that was a more interesting way to go because sex and God and rock and roll, sex and drugs and rock and roll. I mean, there's a sense in which really it's a bit predictable, really. But you don't get too much choice with publishers on things like that. They tend to always go, oh, well, the marketing team thinks this, that, or the other, and what can you do?
It actually reminds me of Alenka Zupancic's book, What is Sex? She didn't want that title.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah, she wanted it to be, I think she has a presentation where she's just giving like sort of the technical description of the book, and it's just like, I just wanted it to be the ontology of sex.
Yeah.
you know, you know?
Yeah. I
It's
mean,
like,
they thought that sex, God, and rock and roll was edgy. I thought I had the I thought I had the edgy title actually, but
yeah, fucking comfort. I mean, maybe we could wade in a little bit before we get directly into what that might allude to. But I just want to give a people an overview because, in some sense, even though the title is not to your liking, there are sort of four major parts here that
yeah,
are sort of structured in a way that sort of relate to that title in some sense. I mean, you have a part on sex, you have a part on drugs, art, and religion, and how did that all come together in your mind? I mean, what do you want the reader to get through each of those different lenses or windows?
well, I was kind of inspired. I mean, I think one of my favorite books of Freud is Civilization and Its Discontents. And he talks in there about the palliatives that we employ to deal with what he calls the vicissitudes of life, sex and intoxicants and art and religion. So I thought, well, those are an interesting way of approaching because I wanted to write. It was kind of I called it at the time a theological memoir. So it wasn't meant to be linear. It wasn't meant to be because I don't believe in the sort of linearity of life. I don't like to thread everything together and A plus B equals C and here's the narrative arc of my life. I so I sort of decided that I wanted to kind of do it in episodes because I think episodes are really how how our life works out. And so it just seemed like an interesting device and a way of kind of thinking about my own life in terms of various ways in which those subjects have appeared or shown up in my world. And then and that's really all I was trying to do. I just wanted to write bits and pieces. And again, originally the book was a lot more I would say rough around the edges. I mean, I had hand-drawn pictures and photographs of notebooks and all of this kind of detritus of my life, but they wanted something a bit more cohesive. So, you know, we had to negotiate those kind of things. And that, you know, that's okay. I mean, if you can't handle being edited, you probably shouldn't try and write, you know. Although I do get a little defensive sometimes about stuff, because you know, when somebody, especially when you're dealing with theological things and somebody goes, well, I don't actually think that, and I'm like, well, yeah, but it's not your story. You know, there are always the gatekeepers of theological discourse, like everything else, who want you to say what they think you should say. But anyway, that was the deal. So I was inspired by that kind of Freudian concept to kind of divide up the elements of my life into those four pieces.
I mean, it's definitely rings to me a type of Freudian book, and specifically the Freud of civilization and its discontents, and in terms of the themes that are coming up, especially in the first part about family and you know what you group under sex and the biological, in terms of just sort of painting the picture of working class life, of discontented life
Yeah.
in general. But you know, it's definitely a shame that you had to battle with the gatekeepers and the marketing teams to, you know, in terms of you know, getting this vision where you wanted it to be and presenting it to the world the way you wanted people to see it. I
Yeah.
did want to sort of labor a little bit on what I thought was a very interesting point at the beginning of the book, which is what you brought up over, you know, that our life is, and the way you understand life is understood through the bits and pieces, you know, the fragments, you know, you say the catastrophes and the epiphanies,
Yeah.
as opposed to the overarching scheme. You know, like we might be able to sort of retroactively make a narrative of these things, but really the real of our life is in these breaks and ruptures.
Yeah, and I think I think I used to adopt that approach. You know, we I mean we live in a world really of these, you know, long overarching stories and theories that encompass all of life and help us to explain our existence in a kind of forward movement, you know, and this led to this and this led to this and of course there is a kind of forward trajectory in life, and it's your own life, and you do live it in a certain way. But I also really do think that there are these things that happen, and they're unexpected, and they're often unplanned, and they can be, you know, catastrophic, either self-induced or, you know, things that come your way, things that might interrupt the life that you have planned for yourself. And I also, but I think it's kind of a more interesting and honest way, because I think what happens, at least in some senses, if you have this like big story of your life, it's very easy to get locked into the frame. Do you know what I mean? And feel like everything's happened for I mean, people say it all the time, everything's happened for a reason, and I'm not so sure about all of that stuff. You know, that was one of my first sort of breaks with religion, really, once I got involved, was this idea that, you know, everything is planned out, and that you're just sort of walking through a story that's been written for you. And I don't know, maybe we'll all discover one day that was true. But in terms of daily lived life. I sometimes think the opposite is true. I mean, we don't know from one day to the next what's gonna happen to us or to the people that we know and to the world around us. And you know, you can look back over your own life or the life of your culture or society, and you can pick up these big threads and put something together. But there's also an awful lot of stuff that's left out. And so I just wanted to pay attention and note the fact that yeah, they're just blips. They're like little blips that happen.
I mean, there's a lot to say on this, but I really do feel like when, if I could just, maybe feed off what you're saying here a little bit is I do think when people put the big frame first, they're putting like the cart before the horse.
Yeah,
Like it's like the blips, like the something missing, the something lacking, the something left out. You
yeah,
have to be open to that,
yeah,
and that disruptive part, and then that disruptive part, you can retroactively make a story about it.
yeah,
And but the thing is like when people get stuck into a frame,
yeah,
like when you're saying like I really resonate with what you're saying in terms of it's very easy for people to get stuck into a frame.
yeah,
And I think what that is basically, you know, people trying to come up with a story so that they can ignore or they can avoid or repress the something missing.
yeah.
So,
I mean, if you have if you feel like you're swimming in a river and you know the contours of it, then you kind of have a bounded world, and there's a little bit of security and comfort that comes with that. I don't think this is in the book, but I took my parents to Hawaii, and my mother had always wanted to go to Hawaii, and so for about and we planned it in advance. This was quite some time ago, and so she wanted to like swim in the ocean. That was her big thing, and she didn't know how to swim. So she went for months with her next door neighbor friend to a local swimming pool near where I grew up in England, and like went swimming for a whole I don't know, maybe a year or something, just so she could go. And we get to Hawaii, and I mean literally, and you know, my mum's like a sort of classic English working class housewife, you know, kind of. I always say she's a bit like Mrs. Doubtfire because she had this little thing she do all the time, and so she just like she got a swimsuit on and sort of marched right down to the water and just went in. And I'm like, well, you know, do you want me to come with you? You know, my dad's there, and you know, she just goes off, and I'm sort of watching, and after a couple of minutes, it looks like she's in a little bit of trouble, and suddenly I realized that she actually might be drowning. And so I like go in and I kind of grab her, and she's a bit flustered, and she goes, "Oh, the what was it she said? She said like the bottom's not flat." And what she'd done is where she'd gone to learn to swim, it was 3 feet deep at the shallow end, but it was also 3 feet deep at the deep end. And she'd basically learned to swim with 1 foot on the ground, bouncing. And then she got into the ocean, and there are waves and there's sand and everything moved. And she couldn't bounce anymore. You know what I mean? There was no ground to bounce on. And it was a very different thing, sort of bouncing bouncing along a swimming pool versus bouncing along in the ocean. And when you suddenly realize that the ground beneath your feet isn't as solid as you thought it was, and there are currents and there are tides and there are waves, and it's all coming at you, you know. And I sometimes think life is, you know, we want life to be a swimming pool, but really it's more like the Pacific Ocean or whatever. Anyway, I don't know how we got off on that tangent, but I'm good. I'm always good for a tangent.
yeah, no, I appreciate it, and it I think it metaphorically communicates the point very well in terms of, when you live in a very fixed frame of reality. I mean, what you're doing is kind of creating an artificial swimming pool
Yeah,
in the Pacific Ocean.
exactly.
And then it might be fun to swim around in the swimming pool for a bit, but the chances of that swimming pool holding up for your whole life
Exactly.
is very low. And then the chances of you encountering the Pacific Ocean and not being able to swim is also very high.
Yeah, and and life comes along and waves knock you sideways. And sometimes they knock you off course and sometimes they put you on course. And you often sort of realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm swimming in an ocean and I'm not where I thought I was. So I don't know. I was just it's just I tend to sit with these ideas for a while and sort of play with the idea and see what sense, if any, it makes in your life to sort of look at things. But I think because I was involved in sort of institutional religion for quite some time, where there's a very dominant narrative thread and story that you're supposedly, well, you're invited into and supposedly a part of, and it's very clear and it's very determined, and the it's all sort of in a sense predetermined and pre-planned. I just sort of, that was probably the one of the things that really caused me to think differently about life, because I found great discomfort in that approach, because I think I've always been slightly well, I never imagined winding up being involved in the business of religion. It was never on the horizon, but then suddenly it was on the horizon, and through a series of moments, that seem at the time, I mean, they're kind of connected, but they're only connected because I can look back on them and go, oh, well, obviously this happened, so it's no surprise, But I mean, it's funny.
Yeah.
I found I found a school report from when I was 8 years old, and it was interesting because my three best subjects at school when I was 8 years and 5 months old, apparently, were music, art, and religion. And so those threads are there somehow. There's so I'm not saying there's not any trajectory, but how that plays out, that's the unpredictable part of life. But I don't need life to be predictable, and I don't need to have it make sense for me, because I've lived long enough to go, life makes no sense.
Yeah. Um,
This juncture in moment, I'm really struggling to make sense of what the hell is happening in the world.
yeah, myself included. No, I think, at least for my approach, you have to befriend the disruption. You have to befriend the uncertainty, like you're saying. You've said in the book about uncertainty being sort of the place where you identify theologically.
Yeah.
There's actually something that you said later in the book, which is a quote that stuck out to me, which is, and just resonates with what you were saying here. He said, quote, do theology by intentionally avoiding the theological, and find new conversation partners.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and to me, that was interesting to situate in regards to sort of what you were saying about, not really feeling, as it were, at home within these deterministic narratives. But at the same time, starting out in the book saying, this is my theological life, and this sort of being about a theological life. So maybe for people who might be confused by that, what does it mean to have lived a theological life?
Well,
What what does that mean to you?
well, I think on a very sort of primal level, what it means, it means sort of two things. One, I've lived a kind of sort of semi-professional theological existence where a large part of my life, not all of it, but a large part of it, has been involved in grappling with issues of, religion and faith and belief, particularly the lens of Western Christianity. And so arguably, and that's the predictable part, because that you can go, oh, well, that makes sense. You dealt with religion, so therefore that's theological. But beyond that, I guess what I might want to say is, even though the word theological is intimately related to the question of God, to me it was and remains more a question about what is the human, and what is the role that we play, and what do we make of this life and this existence that we've been hurled into, and how do we understand what it means to be us. And I think that I also wanted to sort of name it as a theological thing, partly as a little flag against the notion that theological conversations are prescribed conversations that exist in a very specific place and only concern certain people. And I think for me, it was really more a way, perhaps, of, I don't want to say everything is theological, because I don't think anything is everything. but I do feel quite strongly that while in the West for quite some time, the role of religion has diminished in its sort of social impact, the impulses of the religious search or the religious quest or the religious desire or longing or yearning keep manifesting, and they keep on, because I think they are connected more to what it means to be human, to grapple with the idea, whether you subscribe to Lacanian lack, or Deleuzian void, or the God-shaped hole of Augustine, or whoever it is. You know what I mean? That there's something, or consciousness. There's this thing within us that sort of compels us to examine the unexaminable of life, and that to me is that's what I mean by a theological life.
It reminds me of the book that probably affected me the most in the last 10 years was Slavoj Žižek's Less Than Nothing. And
yeah.
Actually, the title for that book was supposed to not be Less Than Nothing. It was supposed to be Eper si muove, and yet it moves.
Yeah.
But this idea of "and yet it moves" is sort of, it seems to be also pointing towards this. What you're saying is, this impulse, this quest, this desire or drive, which just, no, even after the death of God, it keeps going.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Slavoj is very much a sort of, he calls himself a philosopher, but, sometimes I think he's just as much a theologian as he is a philosopher, because he's always bringing up God. I mean,
I agree, yeah.
Sort of declares his atheism very strongly, but then sort of tells you that he's an atheist Christian. You know what I mean? And I think, and part of this was also when I kind of began to reread philosophy when I was younger, but older than when I was originally, sort of reading stuff when I was a teenager and stuff like that. I realized how much of the philosophy that we still wrestle with is grappling with theological themes, whether it's sort of Nietzschean resistance or Hegelian, absolute, essence of Christianity, or whatever he's up to, and talking about how you deal with the death of God and things like that in very different ways. And so I don't know,
Yeah.
I just call it that.
Yeah, no, I mean there's certainly, to me, it's an interesting um topic of, I think future speculation is, you know, again, to just maybe to describe this in Hegelian terms, he'd say the absolute spirit is art, religion, and philosophy.
Yeah,
And in regards to the absolute spirit, like that these terms not only are at war within themselves, but at war with each other. And that there's always these interesting tensions between, like, both within art, religion, and philosophy there are tensions, and between art, religion, and philosophy there are always tensions, but that they're all sort of, you know, grappling with the human and the absolute, and the paradox of the human and the absolute. And yeah, is there anything you wanted to say there?
well, that's sort of really because one of the things that I I sort of wrestled with for a while is I sort of made a decision fairly early in life that I wanted to pursue things that I was curious about. And I've never been sort of singular. So, you know, I taught theology, but I also taught in an art school and I did music and I, you know, worked in fashion and done all kinds of different things. And I used to think that they were all kind of separate conversations. But I realized in some sense that there were lots of intersections and that you can actually bring anything into a conversation with something else if you work out how to interpret the individual languages of whatever disciplines you're discussing. You know what I mean? I always liked, well, I still like the Mark Taylor, the who taught the philosophy of religion at Columbia. And Mark Taylor was very, I think, very interesting because he's one of the sort of early, I think he might have introduced Derrida into, well, lots of people say that, but I know he was very tight with Derrida and very much on that kind of early postmodern ride, you know, and he did a lot of stuff about religion. And he said this statement that's always sort of stuck with me. He said, religion is the most interesting where it's the least obvious. And he went off, and a lot of people thought that he'd given up religion, but he just found it elsewhere in architecture and sculpture and in dirt and all these different kinds of things. You know what I mean? And so I think in many ways that was kind of also a bit of an inspiration or a help for me to kind of not integrate things because I like living with the tension of things. I don't, you know, I'm quite happy if I'm holding two paradoxical ideas, you know, and feel a little bit torn because I don't want to feel too settled in the way I look at the world and sometimes having things rub against each other, that friction sort of keeps you on your toes, keeps you looking for not just information, but understanding about or something, some word that I don't know what the best word would be.
Well, it reminds me of what you would, or what it reminds me of one of the things you would say to your much younger self. There's a part of your book where you have a photo of yourself at, I think, at an AC/DC concert,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and you're like squashed between some people in the crowd, and you have this list of things that you would tell your younger self, which is to that the inner tension is not going to go away.
Yeah.
The inner tension is not going to go away, and that you have to befriend this inner tension to I mean, that all of the precious interesting things are working with this inner tension, or working with this friction, like you're saying.
I mean, I think that's why I found Lacan helpful, you know, with this sort of, you know, with the idea of lack in his sort of approach to it, sort of, you know, embracing the lack or at least coming to terms with it, and then finding out how to live after you come to terms with the lack, you know. So rather than trying to uh, address the lack, address life from that place, and that's always going to be there'll always be tension. There's a tension around desire and stuff anyway. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot you can always say to your younger self. You don't have to wait, you don't have to wait too long to have a conversation with yourself, lighten up, you know, don't try and work it all out on, in an hour. Be kind to yourself,
Yeah,
and
I think
really understand that life, it's a wild ride. It's a
well
wild.
said. If yeah, and I get that, and again, I think that life is a wild ride. That's the truth. That's, you could say, that's maybe the truth of life, and I think that might bring us sort of a little bit of um connection there with what we were saying about the narrative and the missing, or the narrative and the lack, and the swimming pool and the ocean.
Yeah, yeah,
That there's some sort of relationship here that perhaps we all need to cultivate. And maybe the theological life is, maybe, just I'll throw this back to you, but maybe the theological life is that process of gardening. If the metaphor of the swimming pool in the ocean is like this, it's more like a process of gardening, to make sure that you can, as it were. Actually, I connect this very quickly with something I like that David Bowie said, because I know you're a big fan of David Bowie. Is I remember David Bowie said where he likes to be, he gave the metaphor of being on the beach or being in the middle of the ocean. And he said that where you want to be is not, knee deep in the ocean, and you don't want to be drowning in the middle of the ocean. You want to be just on the part where your feet are, your tiptoes are on the sand and your head's above the water. And so you can that's where you're sort of at that creative tension place, but
yeah,
you don't want to drown, and then you don't want to be bored on the beach.
yeah. That's interesting because there's actually a very interesting story in the Old Testament. This prophet Ezekiel, who, a strange character, but fascinating. And there's this vision that he has, and there's a vision of I think it's the temple. The Israelites, God's going to build them this temple, and from this temple he sees water like trickling out. And anyway, he sees this guy, and this guy has got a rope, and he tells him to measure out a certain amount of this, and then he says, and then he finds himself in waters up to his ankles, and then he has to measure another 1,000 cubits or something, and he's in water up to his knees, and then another 1,000, and he's in water up to his loins. The sort of center of creativity in sort of the Hebrew world, the source of life and energy, the creative space. And then the last 1,000, he's in he's in so deep, and he can't swim in it. You know what I mean? And there's this sort of idea, a lot of people then take that to go, he's learning to swim in the mystery and all that kind of stuff. But I actually think the end of the story is he gets taken back to land, and that's where he has to live the mystery. It's that Eugene Thacker thing, the dust of this planet. That's where you live. That's where you live mystery, not in the kind of supernatural realm of the mystical God, I think, but in the supernatural, in the natural mysticism and mystery of life. But yeah, that Bowie thing is interesting because when the water hits you at your loins, you're still in control. You're not control of your life, but you still have some agency in your life. You know what I mean? You're not drowning. And I think striking that balance in life is interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting. Bowie's always good for some info.
Yeah, and I like the way you brought him up in the book as well, and maybe we'll go deeper into that because it's a theme which maybe we'll explore later in the talk. But I do want to dwell a little bit on what you were just saying here, which I think is a really important connecting point to what I wanted, to something I did want to bring up, which is, this distinction between a Christianity or a theology or a form of religion where you're sort of where the mystery is this sort of ineffable, mystical, otherworldly type of sense of mystery, versus sort of the mystical being in the everydayness of life, which
Yeah.
I think you were trying to get at with that story. And I get a sense from meeting you a few times that this is something that maybe you have connection with, and also comes through in your book. I think that, what's your relationship between the religious and even the idea of a theological life, living a theological life, that, what do you make of this idea that, the mystery, the ineffable is at the, it's in your day-to-dayness. And what's your relationship to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing for for me, and it was a sort of, it was a big turning point, was when I realized that my interests in the sort of world of faith or belief and religion weren't necessarily the interests that you might expect. I was never particularly enamored with the idea of chasing after God, or a God. I wasn't looking for God in. I was looking for something, but it wasn't necessarily God, and that was always a quite difficult subject for me, because it was just a sort of a blank. It was an emptiness, but an emptiness with nothing in it. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of just a blank spot in my thinking. And for a while, I sort of tried very hard to kind of give that some sort of life and make it alive for me, as a concept, as an experience, or all those kind of things. But I realized that was, for me, that was a distraction from the mystery of existence. And the mystery of existence was divine enough for me, or sacred enough for me. I didn't need to direct my attention towards some sacred other that was out there. I sort of think I understood that life itself is sacred, in that it's ultimately a gift and an experience that has that's wrapped in this impossibility, this indefinability, this, it's like we sort of, we weren't, we are, we won't be. You know what I mean? And on either, and our life, if you like, is bounded by the unknown, and life in itself, in many ways, is unknown to us. It's like, our desire. You want to dig into Freud or Lacan or whoever. We don't know what we want. And so for me, it was really very much about coming to terms with the mystery and the mysticism of human existence, and realizing that in some ways, and I don't know if I said it in the book, but in many ways, God is, it's just it's a word, and it's a word that we use to give shape to what we actually really can't give shape to, but want to, the unknownness of existence. And I sort of took that away from this notion of some supernatural thing, and kind of brought it down to earth and said, well, if you want to experience transcendence, you don't have to make it the transcendent. It's the transcendence of existence, those moments, those incredible moments in life, that and they come to you. They come to you in sex, in looking at a piece of art. Some people, it comes to them walking
With
through.
the literal other.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do you know what I mean? It's sort of you sense that. But yeah, I don't know. Didn't Freud call it the oceanic feeling? You know what I mean? I don't know.
Well, I think
I don't know.
to me, where I would want to connect what you're saying is we don't know what we want,
Yeah,
and at the same time, these incredible moments come to us. Is that to me like teaching? I'm teaching the Akri right now. What Lacan always repeats over and over again is our desire is alienated in the other.
yeah,
So like me, my ego doesn't know what I want
yeah,
because it's alienated in the other.
yeah,
But if I'm open to the other, if I'm actually open to the, let's say, like the way you're framing things, like, if I'm actually open to the concrete mystery of existence and life
yeah,
without sort of losing myself in sort of, let's say, a specular image of an empty God,
yeah,
then the real divine can come through. And like, to me, I would want to get your opinion on juxtaposing, the way you're saying, because I really resonate with this idea of, I'm not looking for God in that sense. And like the way you're describing it, like an emptiness with nothing in it.
yeah,
To me, I would juxtapose the emptiness with nothing in it to like the lack or the emptiness with potentiality or possibility in it.
yeah.
It's like the pluripotential void.
Yeah, I mean, I really love Maria Ruti's work around those notions. I think she does a really great job in sort of looking at the potentialities of a life around lack in that particular way. I think she does really great work on sort of thinking through the psychic life in the way that you just sort of described, and really wrestling through those things, and that's what appeals to me. And I also, and I think as well, it was also the the separating of things that bothered me a little bit as well. Do you know what I mean? Like I know people. It's very easy to go, well, God's up in heaven. I don't mean it quite that naively, but the kind of notion that there's life here and then there's this thing going on around that has agency in your world, and sort of pokes his nose or their noses into the business of human beings, and then your focus gets directed towards that and not towards. I
I'm
I
totally with you.
I'm not a materialist in the purest sort of humanist sense of things, because I've lived too much life that it is materially immaterial. Do you know what I mean? Because
I was just going to say, the primary distinction to me is not between materialism and idealism, but some sort of relationship between material and immaterial.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
The immaterial internal to material.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's really where people start talking about I mean, that's where you can get into all kinds of interesting conversations, I suppose, about consciousness and about the soul and all those. I mean, I think, again, those are just words that we use, I think, to try and bring those two things together.
I mean, this might be a really interesting window into the first part of your book, the part on sex and what you call the biological. So, because there's a few of these paradoxes that come screaming at me in this part of the book. Which is like, for example, there's a few that stick out, like, emphasizing this type of Christianity, which you say is like very, very, like, let's pay attention to this thing up here. Life is down here, but let's pay attention to this thing up here. And then consequently, you have sort of this religious view on sexuality or approach to sexuality, which is only prohibitive, a very naive, has nothing really to say about sexuality. But then, of course, your book's not linear, but it starts off with this fucking comfort, right? Yeah. Like it starts off with this really interesting story, where the sexual and the religious, or the sexual and God, are really intertwined in a really interesting way through an example of counterculture.
Yeah.
And sort of getting, your historical window into the counterculture will be super interesting in this conversation to me, because, juxtaposing it with where our culture is now from that time, when it feels like we're in a very different place. But maybe get your view on what's going on in the counterculture with the relationship between sex and God, and all of the things that are happening there.
Now or then?
I mean,
both.
I think both, but
Yeah.
maybe the evolution, like what's happening at that time, between sex and God, and then where do you see that moving today?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I sort of I came of age in the late 70s, which really I think it's that generation, or decade or so after like the height of the 60s, free love and stuff like that. But it's a time pre-AIDS or pre-HIV. So there's a certain there's still a naivety and a novelty about the liberation of sexuality within certain horizons. I mean, you sort of wade into a whole world when you start talking about sexual liberation and all that kind of stuff. But if we're sort of painting broad brush, the 60s gave rise to new possibilities and new permutations. But at the same time, it also gave rise to new possibilities and new permutations about the sacred, because it was the counterculture that in many ways sort of firstly turned towards the East and embraced different. I mean, there's always this thing that young people abandoned religion in the 1960s. They may have abandoned institutional forms of Christianity for the most part, but they were still embracing alternative things, whether it was meditation or yoga or Eastern spirituality and stuff like that. But interestingly, there was also a kind of turn around again towards Christianity, because the sort of hippie Jesus was very much a focus in the 60s counterculture and stuff, and that gave rise to different kinds of communities, from sort of legit kind of institutional religious organizations to kind of communes and things like that, where people were still wrestling through or working with the sexual and the erotic. I mean, I think one of the interesting things again to me is that I think the erotic, the sensual and the spiritual are intimately entwined with each other. And again, you run into problems when you try and strong arm the one to supposedly protect from the other. You know what I mean? And so my initial kind of encounter with any kind of countercultural religion came through a sexual encounter with someone who was in basically a Christian cult, about which I had no clue and no real interest, and that was only sort of presented to me after the erotic act, if you like, and of course that whole world was bathed in all kinds of problems. So I don't want to valorize it. It was a cult-like environment for people, I think, and a lot of people manipulated and in their sort of naivety kind of convinced to do things that they probably wouldn't want to have done, if they weren't encountering that. But of course, it was sort of wrapped up, because it's amazing what you can wrap up in the name of God. whether it's whether it's violent or sexual. I mean, it happens, and it keeps happening over and over and over again. And a part of me says we ought to pay more attention to that, and kind of mine those things, and try and work out a little more what those things are all about. But for the most part, Christianity operates with very heavy taboos about sexuality. Particularly in the latter part of the 20th century, it became very much a central core of much of Christianity was the rejection of sexual liberation, and of a sort of almost, I don't know if you call it Victorian, but a kind of a very prohibitive view on sexuality that itself was presented as a countercultural movement. So everybody's into free love. We're not going to have free love because there is no free love. We're going to, it's sex between a man and a woman within the confines of marriage, and you wait until you're married to have sex. And but that happens within a culture that's taken the lid off sexuality and occasionally tries to put it back on. But, once the genie's out of the bottle, you never go back. I don't think you can ever go back to where you were. That's the danger of nostalgia, is you're trying to go home to a place, A, that never was in the first place, but you also can't get there. And I think what's interesting to me when I think about then and now, we talk so much more about sex and sexuality today. It's so much more prescribed, and I would say arguably conservative in the sense that it's riddled with complications. And again, I realize this is a huge subject that we could spend forever talking about. So I don't want to dismiss any of the complexities of stuff like that. But there are interesting, there was that whole, that sort of religious cult thing that happened in LA, the Nexium cult, that was a big thing a couple of years ago, where people were sort of branded by the leader of the cult, and they, there are always that. And I lived in Los Angeles for a long time. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on in that world. But I think the inability of traditional religions sometimes to address the shifting tides of these things is what creates problems for people, and you hold these fast and hard lines that in some ways don't make sense. They get sanctified, suddenly this is what God wants from you. There's never any real discussion about why that is or where that came from, or any awareness that it hasn't always been that way. You know what I mean? I don't know if I'm making sense here. So tell me if I am or I'm not, or if I
think you're just zeroing in on one of the most interesting issues of both theology, philosophy, and psychoanalysis, which I would summarize as sort of like the relationship between the law and desire.
Yeah.
Like all of the paradoxes that we experience. Yeah. Did something you wanted to say there?
No. I'm glad you're sort of tracking with me, but I do think you're right, because that's the thing, isn't it? The prohibition and what the law does, and where desire fits in all of that, and the tensions that are caused by a society that tells you you can have what you want, but then tells you can't have what you want in the way that you want it. And again, going back to civilization and its discontents, it's Freud's thing, the kind of the primal instinctual urge has to be sort of constrained so that we can live within the civilization, but the civilization creates these inner agonies and tensions and anxieties that we then have to address. And religion drills down really hard, particularly in the latter part of the 20th century, on sexuality. And, you know, that became the in some ways, arguments or theories or theologies about sex and sexuality have become the determining ones, you know, and they still exist today in a lot of mainstream Christianity, with issues around, you know, homosexuality, transsexuality, or all of these things. And so I think we live in a very complicated time sexually, really, because there are so many facets that live in little pockets all of their own, you know. Sexuality, sex, gender, identity, the act of sexuality, you know, the act of sex, erotic desire, sex as pure biology, you know, or animalistic impulse and urge versus you know, an essential part of humanity, you know, all of those things. There's an interesting book that I've just started to read by Darian Leader called "Is It Ever Just Sex?" And the answer, of course, is no. I mean, you don't really need to read the book on one level to know that the answer is no. It's never just about sex. It's a world. But I do think what gets missed in that is that, I mean, what is it? Giorgio Agamben, in his book on nudities, says nudity in Western culture has a theological signature, because, you know, a defining and shaping story of Western culture, whether we believe it or not, it's in the vapors of Western sort of cultural formation, is the sort of story from the book of Genesis about Adam and Eve and how they, you know, eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and their eyes are opened and they're naked and ashamed, and so they get clothed by God, you know. And before that happened, they weren't clothed, but they weren't ashamed of their nakedness. You know what I mean? So for Agamben, you know, the very notion of the naked human has a theological inscription on it, and we forget that. You know, because I think I think there's veracity to that idea. You know, because that's a story that we told ourselves in Western societies for hundreds of years, and because we deem a story no longer viable, the vapor trail still lives. You know, and our cultural attitudes towards sex and sexuality are shaped by our histories and our past experiences with it, both personally and socially. And if we don't face them and learn how to deal with our past in a way that doesn't inhibit our present, then we find ourselves, I think, in troubling times. And I think part of the theological conversation that's missing from sexuality conversations at the moment is precisely that we're not taking into account our personal and social histories around sex and sexuality.
Well, I might take up your challenge in regards to this, because it's something that perplexes me in terms of, you know, let me just jump off. There's so many things you've said that I want to touch on, but focus on this is, you know, that nudity has a theological significance, that it's in part because of the stories we've told ourselves historically, but also the vapor trails of those in our present day. And, you know, for me, I just want to relate to this as like, is there another side to this? Because I was raised in a non-Christian household. I was raised in a secular household.
Oh.
But if I remember, like, my greatest fear when I was still a virgin was the other seeing me naked.
Yeah.
you know, and encountering, and you know, the first time I had a girlfriend and we were gonna have sex, that all of the emotions circulating around, you know, and the weird thing is that, like, I'd imagine, you know, she's worried about what I'm thinking about her naked, and I'm worried about what she thinks about me naked. So it's always about the other
Yeah,
and
always.
the other gaze.
Yeah.
And is this a human universal that different religions could develop stories about? Is there something about our birth, our nakedness in birth? Like, is there a psychoanalytic explanation for why these stories might appear the way they do? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, my sort of immediate answer is, well, I don't know, but it's a very interesting it's a very interesting sort of notion. I don't think that all societies have the same reactions. You know what I mean? And I do think that in in what some would say, you know, in Western civilization, nakedness has increasingly been something that we've sought to move away from. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of, I think, a lot of shame that gets associated and attached to nakedness. I mean, it's vulnerability, isn't it? And maybe at its core, I mean, because clothing is in a sense armor. It's a protective shield by which you are identified by others. You know, particularly, you know, throughout, if you sort of, you know, look at the history of fashion and stuff, the way people used to dress in very particular ways, very prescribed ways and stuff like that. But we cover ourselves against the elements. You know, we cover ourselves for comfort. We cover ourselves to make statements about who we are, and to some degree, we cover ourselves to hide who we are. You know, it's like for much of my life, whenever I'm having a really tough time, I always dress up. I put a suit on. I just do. I mean, I wear suits a lot anyway, but when I find myself in a really difficult time, I sort of dress up, and it's very much like a I don't know, it's like an armor, and it's a way, it's like I'm being self-protective, you
I
know.
think this is so, there's so many interesting contradictions here, like that like require like just thinking and conversation. Is like, so like I totally vibe with what you're saying and pointing towards it. It's the vulnerability.
Yeah.
I want to connect it to something that's been coming up in the Cree course a lot, the impotence,
Yeah.
feeling of impotence. But also I wanted to get your opinion on the relationship between hiding and showing, nakedness and clothing, um I get, or even like what's hidden and what's revealed
Yeah.
in regards to nakedness and wearing clothing. Like, because, like, for example, like if I'm just interpreting it in pure discursive form,
Yeah.
like, is like, so let me frame this in the context of, let's say, an intimate relationship.
Yeah.
Is if someone just lets it all out
Yeah.
discursively, like reveals everything they actually feel,
Yeah.
is that the truth? Or is it sort of shaping discourse in a way that's not lying, which is not hiding anything important, but which is telling the truth with a more aesthetic form? Like, so I'm trying to say is, like, what's the truth here? Is the truth just letting it all out, or just being naked? Or is the truth dressing it up?
Well, you know, I mean, what is it? Freud says, he says, honesty, frankness, and candor are not characteristics of the unconscious, which is I mean, there's a lifetime's thinking, but on one level, I think what I think that means is that what we reveal about ourselves is what we're comfortable revealing about ourselves. You know, there's that whole idea of like, no, you know, what we know about ourselves that we then tell about ourselves in this sort of honest, frank way is, in a sense, remains a protection, because we're not actually acknowledging what we don't know about ourselves. So I think I think in, you know, in response to your comment, which is really fascinating, there is truth, but not the whole truth, because we don't know the truth about ourselves, do we? That's the truth. That's the truth of the matter, is this notion that we can ever know the truth about ourselves, I think, is probably folly. You know,
Yeah.
we can understand things about ourselves, but I think our desire is always going to be an ongoing process of coming to terms with. And when it comes down to something like nakedness, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and we all have different. Well, we have different relationships with our bodies, because we have different relationships with ourselves. Some people are very comfortable being naked and don't think twice about it. And then there are other people that almost can't be naked. You know what I mean? And then you have the sort of religious things, you know, like the whole, you know, Orthodox Judaism, where you know, you have sex through a sheet, you know, and there are all these, you know, prohibitions and taboos. And then you have the history of nakedness. So, you know, different ages, different parts of the body are taboo. You know, you can't show your ankle, or you can't show you know, your décolletage, or your neck, or your wrists, you know, and these things get eroticized. And we live in a sort of era where everything has kind of been on show, and everything is erotic, and nothing's erotic anymore. You know, and then you get into that whole thing of, you know, the kind of normalizing of fetishism and BDSM and all those things that used to be very marginal and in the shadows, that are now, oh, you know, I mean, you can write sort of Housewife, 50 Shades of Grey's book about it. And yet we're still wrestling with what is sex. What is sex, you know, wherever you want to put that emphasis, and threaded in there are the questions, because it, you know, what is it? It's the most profound thing. And again, this sort of, to me, says, well, then here's another theological conversation around which you don't really need any notion of a particularized sense of God. We're talking about something that cuts to the core of being human and continuing humanity on one level. I mean, I guess we'll sort of reach the point at one point, and maybe we already have, where, I mean, one of the interesting things about sex today is apparently lots and lots of young people are not having it because of digitality. I think there's a big problem in Japan, for instance, with kind of isolated people who sort of never engage in intimate relationships with other human beings. And, you know, there's concerns about, you know, birth rates and growth rates and all those kind of things, and aversion to sexuality, and a move towards, you know, AI and digital sexuality. You know, Alfie Buckbound, a friend, you know, has written a lot about, you know, AI dating and you know, and all this kind of stuff, which is only muddying the waters around what's already a very complex subject. And it was a defining element, that kind of connection between the erotic and the spiritual was the axis upon, that was one of the moments, one of the episodes around which and within which my life, which was turned sort of very in a kind of big sort of in a big way, really. But at the time, I didn't put two and two together.
Yeah, I mean, again, what you're saying is sort of again bringing up this like mega philosophical topic to me between law and desire.
Yeah.
And the paradox of, on the one hand, when sort of law is pardon me, when law is everything, when prohibition is everything, it can sort of eroticize things which are normally not seen as erotic, like the neck, the ankles, the wrists, whatever. And then when the law is absent and it's just desire, then it's kind of like you get this permissivity that leads to a paradoxical frigidity. Like, for example, young people not having sex, or young people not engaging with the other and actually sort of delibidinalizing the other, while sort of having a sort of narcissistic libidinal charge just in a sort of autistic autonomous sense. Like, for example, I did an analysis, I always look every year, on sort of the geographic distribution of the most searched terms on Pornhub. So, and in Japan and East Asia, it's hentai.
Yeah.
So hentai is like a form of animated porn.
Yeah.
So the point is that in East Asia, at the same time as the actual other is being delibidinalized, like no more, not having sex, not having romantic relations, then they are libidinally charging animated phenomena.
Yeah. I mean, it's again, all, this is also very, very fascinating. That reminds me of Dominic Petman's book, Peak Libido, where he sort of argues that we've reached this point of, peak libido, where, something's gone off the rails here with libido. And yeah, I really like that kind of idea of, when there's law, things get heightened. It's that, prohibition, transgression thing. And I mean, transgression in some ways it's where you get the erotic charge, isn't it? That's what's so interesting. And what's funny, or not funny, but worth noting, is there's an awful lot of transgression and erotic charging throughout the Bible. There's a lot of, there's like chaotic. So you have, for instance, the stories of King David, who is called in the Bible a man after God's own heart, who scammed on somebody else's wife, commits adultery, and gets her husband murdered. And this is a guy who apparently has a pure heart, and or you got his son Solomon, who had, I don't know, 700 wives and 1,000 concubines. So you got these two, and yet, and then today you have Christianity sort of basically, no sex till you're married, and between a man and a woman, except for certain churches that are supposedly more progressive about things, more inclusive and stuff like that, but still a very weak understanding, I think, of desire and the erotic and the sacred. I did go once many years ago, and I heard M. Scott Peck speak about sexuality and spirituality, and that was one of the first times I sort of come across somebody who was grappling with those things, and at the time it seemed like, wow, more people should be doing this.
Well, it's interesting. I want to just comment what's coming to my mind when you say that, Christianity doesn't really have much, at least this form of Christianity doesn't have much to say about desire and the sexual. Is sort of like a paradox here, is that, what I was just reading Kant with Sade in the Acree, and Lacan is giving his comments on Sade's philosophy in the bedroom, which is, of course, a treatise about sexuality and sort of very sadistic forms of sexuality. And he concludes at the end of the paper that Sade's philosophy in the bedroom has nothing really to say about desire, that it's a tomb of reason. So he's saying that even this sort of like basically, I think what he's saying is like, when you have a too permissive, sadistic, fetishistic sexuality, that this doesn't teach us about desire. But then also the extreme law doesn't teach us about desire. That there's something about, I wanted to like re-quote what you were saying about, and then maybe get your opinion on it, is you said, quote, "It's amazing what you can wrap up in the name of God around the violent and the sexual."
Yeah.
And that religion has a difficult time understanding sort of the sways or the oscillations between law and desire. I was just thinking, like, there's something here about sexuality. What is sexuality? What is desire? That sort of, I would say, has to have sort of a dialectic of prohibition and transgression, a dialectic of law and desire that doesn't go too far to one side, and allows us to, I don't know, enjoy in a way that's with the other.
Yeah, I mean, the complication now, well, a complication now, I think, is that in the world in which we find ourselves, it's very difficult to get consensus on where we might go with those things. You know what I mean? And this is a problem in that, while I certainly don't think that in the past societies were as homogenous as people like to think they were, but there was a sort of overarching narrative that lots of people subscribe to, varying degrees and stuff. Now we have so many competing voices that everything becomes an argument and a polarized positioning before there's even a conversation about things. In fact, without jumping off on another thing, it's very difficult in this day and age, it seems, to have a meaningful exchange with people, because we sort of seem to come out with our guns blazing, holding our ground, and protecting our territory before we've even heard what the other might have to say. And that complicates things when it comes to talking about something like sex and sexuality. And you think of all the damage that gets done to people when they get caught up in the middle of all of these battles over sort of ideological positions, because we are talking about human beings who are trying to come to terms with their own desire and the way they are in the world, and I think that's what's that loose Irigaray quote, I'm not you. I'm me, I'm not you. I can't remember exactly what it is, but there's an interesting quote that she says, where basically the relief is, to be able to, if you can deal with your own life and not go caught up so much in the projections of your own idealizations and fantasies on the other, and you can work through those things in such a way that you're able to see that you are you and the other is the other, then perhaps there's a way in which we can move towards richer conversations. But at the moment, it seems there's an awful lot of idealizing and projecting onto other people what we want from them and what we want them to say and who we want them to be. And yeah, it's difficult.
I mean, it reminds me of something I would often say at the end of my doctorate. It was something like true love is beyond, or real love is beyond the idealization of the other, something along those lines.
Yeah,
but
I think right. I think
you also quote, I wanted to bring this up, is very relevant. In the first part of your book, you bring up Alain Badiou on the question of sexual encounters, where you say, pardon me, all sexual encounters are about an encounter with ourselves. Sex separates. We are in a sexual relationship with ourselves through another. So there's this idea that in sexuality, we're really meeting the other within ourselves.
Yeah.
And they're meeting the other within themselves, which is kind of like what I maybe connected to what I was saying about that story about being seen naked for the first time, or seeing the other naked for the first time, is that we're really encountering the other within ourselves. And that there's something about sexuality related to sort of ontological grounding and ungrounding.
Yeah.
like that we can become ungrounded within ourselves, or we can ground ourselves. And so this is, I think, where this might be related to what you were saying about conversations being very difficult, because we kind of come with a certain ontological ground and we're not willing to budge on that ground with the
Yeah.
other. And then if then we're not willing to sort of take in something radically other from the other, because that might unground us.
Yeah. Yeah. And it ungrounds you when you haven't sort of taken the time to age with your own, I think, you haven't taken the time to deal with your own idealizations and fantasies about yourself and about, what you want from somebody else. And I guess that's also Lacan, isn't it? There is no sexual relationship in its very sort of blunt form, is that, we, of course, it can seem very callous to say, you're having sex with somebody, but really you're having, it's for you. And of course, you don't have sex with just anybody. Well, I mean, some people do, but generally that doesn't work out that well. We make choices, and we find people with whom we want to be vulnerable and who want to be vulnerable with us. But I still think it holds true that ultimately, in the sexual act, it's as much about what's going on with us and what we want, which is again why sometimes it gets problematic, because we come I was going to say we come to the table, but we come to the bed with different expectations, don't we? Quite often, and all of us. I mean, I don't think in life you seldom have sex for exactly the same reason that you had it the last time. Sometimes it's for comfort, sometimes it's for the rush, sometimes it's for intimacy, sometimes it's for pleasure, sometimes it's to give pleasure, sometimes it's to be present, sometimes it's to be absent. You know what I mean? I mean, we talk about fucking our troubles away. I mean, there's a sense in which that's very much a means by which we're using sex as a kind of palliative. So, well, we didn't
Might
get
be,
yeah,
it might be. I mean, we can definitely talk about this forever, but it might be a good bridge into another major theme in your book, which is, just trying to think of a bridge here to death, in terms of in terms of sex being a type of palliative to run away from our troubles. There's, again, sort of inspired by some of the stories that you tell at the beginning of your book. You one of the most powerful stories to me, because I could, not because it was just well written, but also because it was sort of something I could personally relate to, was the story you were telling about your relationship to your dad at the end.
Yeah.
Who was someone who, seemed to be, he had his own relationship to sex or porn as a palliative, and someone who you said was very silent and didn't show his joy in some sense, but really taken by how he approached the end, where there's this scene in chapter 2, I think, where you're trying to ask him, is there anything that he would want for his funeral or his death? Because at the time, I think he had terminal cancer.
Yeah.
And he said his response was, I don't care. Just put me in a box, burn me, and throw the ashes away. It doesn't matter. I won't be here anyway. And I feel like that was so super powerful, because it gets to sort of, I feel like, a general sentiment that many people might have today, especially in a post-religious death of God era, that, there's no more fantasies about the afterlife. Look, even the lineage, the history, the tombstone, whatever, I don't care.
Yeah.
Just, I was here, I wasn't seen, and I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
And just that's the end of it. And sort of, you know Yeah, what do you think is going on there, and what do you think that this story might have to teach us about maybe our general relationship to death today?
Well, on one level, you could read that story and you could say that my father was very not courageous is the right word, but bold in the sense that he accepted a finality with a certain kind of blitheness. But the other side of that is, and I don't know because my father wasn't a communicator, but my experience of my father was an immense resignation about his place in the world, and a kind of stunting of his own desires. You know, I think I said in there that I grew up in a home without any ambition. There's just no sense that there was a sort of forward trajectory in life. And you know, given that my father basically lived a mile from where he grew up and did the same job pretty much all of his adult life and never moved from the initial position that he got in that job, even though he could have. I think that that resignation was an indicator of his resignation throughout life, and I think so. I was. It was frustrating to me because it was another reminder of whatever. It was a reminder of what I could never work out and never discover, is why it was that he was so resigned to his fate throughout his lived life and then even at the end. But by the same token, I I also think, bloody hell, he must have had a strong internal something going on, because he very seldom showed any sort of. I mean, my dad was weird about my dad would be more anxious about mayonnaise on a sandwich than you know, like the unknown in terms of anything outside of his ordinary life. And yet he seemed to live this very almost monastic internal existence of never really expressing much external emotion and things like that. But I do think what it if I sort of extrapolate a bit from there, and I talk more about death in general, I do think we've lived at a time where we've moved death further and further away from us, you know. Although that's changing. I mean, the fact that more and more people want to go home to die now, you know, and you have in-home hospice and palliative care and things, and people don't want to be away from home, and there's a change in that. But we've lived through an era where we've been able to distance ourselves from death in ways, I think, that for many people through much of history that wasn't possible. I also think that perhaps we've diminished life by not looking at death as much, because I do think that coming to terms with the finitude of existence is what potentially can give your life a kind of charged possibility, because there is a finality to it. There is an end to which we have to come to terms. And I don't know. I don't know about afterlife or after death. I have no theory about it. I don't particularly subscribe to the sort of Christian idea of, the afterlife. It seems like just an attempt to extend what we can't comprehend, which is non-existence. And and people, as will quite often then talk about Buddhism and all that kind of stuff, but they have reincarnation, so, or some forms of it, of Buddhism do, or most people, we develop these theories of the afterlife, I think, basically because we don't know how to deal with non-being. But I do think it's kind of really important to look death in the face and acknowledge that as a part of life. It's complicated, not easy. That was a very difficult conversation to have with my dad. The only reason I could do it, I think, is because I've had similar conversations with quite a few people in my life because of the nature of the work that I did, particularly when I was very involved in sort of churches and things like that, talking to people about death. And it's interesting. I mean, I've encountered quite a lot of people coming to the end of their lives, and how people, right, the day before I left Los Angeles, I went and sat with a 94-year-old Yorkshireman who was dying of cancer. And at the end, we shook hands because he was kind of formal, and he said, well, I don't think we're going to be seeing each other again. He said, because I'm not sure I don't think much about heaven, and I know you don't either, but it's been a pleasure knowing you, but it was interesting. He was a pathologist. He taught pathology. So he had great understanding about, the human body, and was very reconciled to his own passing, and could talk about it on two levels. That, what was happening to him physically, because he was very well acquainted with disease and its impact upon the body. But he also had some kind of tenuous non-theistic belief that also enabled him to appreciate the life that he'd lived while embracing the unknown at the end.
I love a lot of that. Thanks for your reflections on that. I mean, it does give me an opportunity to bring up something that I did want to bring up from your book of the advice from David Bowie, which was to confront a corpse.
Yeah.
Which I thought was pretty powerful, and just because that there's something about sort of confronting the body completely decharged from libido. The body in Mortito, or the body in Thanatos.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah. Well, I was just gonna say that for me, the story that you were depicting with your dad, I have a sort of similar, albeit different, relationship to the story with my dad, who also passed away from terminal cancer, and also sort of an experience of confronting a corpse, being by my grandfather's side while he passed, and sort of being profoundly shaken by that experience. I would take it as like an arc example of having your narrative shook up by being open to death, by being open to being there, in what cannot be symbolized, in what cannot be narrativized, and having your narrative retroactively transformed as a result of that openness to the event.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I lost two friends one when I was 16 and one when I was 17. One a really good friend of mine who was killed in a car crash and was the first that was the first body I saw in death, because my grandparents died when I was much younger, and so that, you know, I just didn't do that. So I saw and then my second friend died by suicide. But when my first friend was killed in this car crash, it was an incredibly sobering moment because, you know, when you're 16, you're immortal, and nothing's going to stop you. And there's a recklessness that can easily go wrong. And to be honest, my friend was killed by somebody else's recklessness, not his own. You know what I mean? But we all, I think, have that potential when we're young to do things that can cause harm to us. And I mean, you know, but and that really threw me for a while. I mean, I started wearing black straight away, and I wore black for an awful long time. I got in trouble because you know, I went to a school with uniforms, and they wanted me to wear the uniform, and I didn't, and so I left school sort of earlier. Then I went back a year later, but it was, but by the same token, it sort of, it didn't undo me. It caused me to begin to reflect on, well, what is this about then, this thing called life, if it can be cut so quickly and so easily in the blink of an eye? And there's something about that, which is why you know, Bowie's thing is true. And I don't know, and it was funny because after that, it didn't really bother me seeing another body again. It's interesting. And to the point, you know, I mean, when I say I've been around enough people, I could sort of tell when somebody was really sort of on their way out. That's how many sort of things I'd sat through. And I don't mean that in a flippant way. But I do think there's something about, and even, you know, the whole notion of the death of God, the end of the grand story of a life or an idea is a profound thing. And to me, like, the death of God is a sort of reminder that all stories have finitude built into them. No story lasts forever. We may tell it, but we tell it differently over and again, and it begins and it ends, and it begins and it ends. And for me, the death of the human and the death of God are sort of reminders that we live our lives within these horizons of what, I don't know. But, you know, I think I quoted my theology on death comes from Jackson Browne. I don't know what happens when people die. Can't think about it as hard as I try. It's like a song that I hear ringing quite right in my ears. I can't sing, but I can't help listening.
Yeah, there was I think passages towards the end of your book that were expressing this, or maybe even actually actually in the first part. I think you say, got the quote here, death is like a song you can't help listening to, but even though it is all in our ears, no one can sing it, the great mystery of life.
Yeah.
I mean, and that brings us to any, like you're saying, like that you don't have any theory of the afterlife, that any theory is a guessing game. And I mean, it would be interesting, I think, for you to expand on that a little bit about how you approach that from a theological perspective.
Well, yeah. Well, so how I sort of approached it from the theological perspective was, you know, contemporary Western Christianity, well, contemporary Christianity across the board in the last couple of 100 years I would argue, has been primarily focused on what happens to you when you die, and the whole notion that and it's a very sort of Platonic Greek notion that the most important part of you is the bit that you actually can't see, the soul, this notion of the soul. So, where will your soul go when you die? Well, I always had problems with the idea of the soul, mainly because I sort of grew up without religion and fairly rationalistic and very much reliant upon what I could understand. But I again I sort of realized, or I thought, that it was essentially an attempt both to prolong life, because that's really what the afterlife is about, isn't it? You get to live somewhere else. You get to live in heaven with Jesus or with God, or you get to come back as, something else or someone else. And it's a very central part of most religion, that there's something
eternal.
There's something eternal, and there may well be something eternal. There may well be, but if there is, it's beyond my ability to grasp or understand what that might look like, and I can't, with any degree of confidence, say I have a soul, and when my physical body dies, some essence of me will live on elsewhere. It's a nice idea, because on one level, it's the thought of non-being can be, it's an intense thing to think about, and there are those moments when you go, but then you have those nights where you don't dream, and maybe that's don't they call that the sleep of death, when you don't dream or something. But theologically it becomes complicated if you subscribe to particular notions of things like the soul, and it's very difficult within confessional Christianity to get around things like that. And so for me, that sort of involved really a rejection of confessional Christianity built around sort of particular creedal ideas, which is why I sort of have spent most of the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years really sort of utilizing radical theology, which is theology after the death of God, and for me, also after the death of the soul. So I don't know what so the interior life is. It's not that I don't believe there's an inner life or that there is an interiority, but to me it's just a part of what it means to be human, and I don't separate it. I tend to think, well, this is all me, and I don't think there's a better part of me inside, this kind of ghostly thing that
Ghost in the machine.
Ghost in the machine, that I'm a human being, and that the best I can do is try and grapple with those things, but within the horizon of an end game.
Back to the again, it's false to erect a distinction between the ideal and the material. It's more the material and the immaterial, or the machine and its own immateriality, as opposed to some
exactly.
Cartesian
And
substance.
I'm always ready to be proved wrong, corrected, shown something, but I think when it comes to things like that, that's when you're in the realm of well, maybe
Well, I'll say
I believe I believe in soul, but I believe in Aretha Franklin.
Well, I was gonna say that this idea of the eternal soul did sort of strike a sort of philosophical discord, I think, between Kant and Hegel, in the sense that I think Kant left room for this place of an eternal soul.
Yeah.
And Hegel, in some sense, dialecticized this notion, and I guess cut out the separation,
Yeah.
which I think he felt was implicit in the phenomena noumena divide.
Yeah.
But we don't need to go too far down that. I mean, I think going back to the radicality and the importance of your assertion here in regards to facing and confronting death. One of the interesting things in your book was you said that you would rather preside over funerals than weddings. I thought that was intriguing.
Have you ever seen that reality show Bridezilla?
I think so. I think I haven't watched it, but I think I've come across it.
I mean, well, I think it's because, I mean, on one level,
I definitely don't want to be anywhere around Bridezilla. I'll say that. I just can intuit that.
I mean, on one level, I'm probably being a little contrary, but by the same token, I'm actually not, because I think when you're dealing with the end of life, things get real, and there is an awful lot of fantasy at work. I mean, there's fantasy at work in a funeral as well, because the liturgies of the afterlife and stuff like that play out. But there is also an awareness of the end of things. And a wedding is quite often the fantasy experience of, it's a cultural fantasy enacted out. I'm not diminishing it. I've been at beautiful weddings and stuff like that, but there's something about well, I think we grieve because we've loved. And I think that sometimes it's only in those final moments that we actually realize and get a glimpse of what love really means to us. And I don't think that that's always so at the root of a lot of the weddings that I've presided over. That's all. And I don't want to take away from anybody's wedding, and it's not like I'm not being negative about it. It's just that I think there's something when people come together to celebrate a life that's now gone, and they come to terms with, or perhaps don't sometimes come to terms, but they face the grief and loss. The something gets shifted, and I think we do experience the depth. We allow ourselves in our grief to feel things that we keep at a distance in everyday life. Sometimes to cope, but sometimes because we're sort of contained in our little worlds where we're sort of told what we should and shouldn't do. I mean, I've always loved the fact that in certain cultures, when somebody dies, there are the sort of professional mourners that come. And and they make great display of mourning. In different cultures they have particular cries and particular shouts and things like that, and it ritualizes death, but it also creates a space for mourning, but also for love to be experienced, I think, in a very, very deep and profound way.
Well, I was just going to say that
I didn't expect that we would be talking about any of these things, by the way. It's kind of cool.
No. Hopefully it's okay. Yeah, I've enjoyed it. I'm enjoying this conversation quite a lot.
I'm actually really grateful, because usually it winds up talking about, rock and roll, and there's nothing wrong with rock and roll, but
Yeah, we would touch on AC/DC if you like a little bit. No, we did touch on David Bowie, but philosophical aspects of David Bowie anyway. But I just want to bring it back to your point about weddings and funerals, because I think I would want to say, like, maybe give this perspective and get your feedback on this. Is I always sense that certainly with weddings, there can be a strong narcissistic element to the wedding.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a certain aspect of a wedding which I just cannot fathom how we continue doing it, in the sense of spending so much money, having all this social performativity around this event, which is just sort of like a sort of a grotesque narcissistic display, usually of the bride, but possibly also of the groom. I suppose, however, there can also be a narcissist. I would interpret, I'm just getting this idea now. There can also be a narcissistic aspect to the funeral. And I would say maybe when we do get into sort of liturgies of the afterlife, maybe that is sort of the narcissism of the individuals there. Sort of, they can fantasize and imagine that life just goes on, and it's not sort of like a real confrontation with lack. But like that, what I want to get to is it possible for us to think weddings and funerals where the real root is love? You know, because that seems to me like, to make this distinction between narcissism and love, and that like it seems to me like having love at the center of birth, sex, or birth, weddings, and funerals would be, you know, the found, like that would be a, like that to me would be the ground of a robust culture.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, arguably, people would say, well, that's why we got married, because we love each other, you know. But I think that's sort of rooted in so many cultural notions about, you know, romantic love, and the performance of the ritual of a wedding ceremony, and the way that we do it in our culture, which is sort of because we're so influenced by what everybody else is doing and what should be done. And as you say, you know, people spend an awful lot of money on a ceremony that, to be quite honest, in my experience, the bride particularly, but usually the bride and groom, have very little experience of, because in the moment they tend to be a little bit out of body because the reality of the moment actually does dawn upon people. And while they generally 9 times out of 10, or maybe 9.5 times out of 10, want to be there, there is I mean, it's interesting. There is something that occurs when people sort of make this public declaration of their intent to be with this particular person, and I think it can overwhelm a little bit at times. But there's an awful lot of energy that goes into something that a lot of people afterwards will say, yeah, I don't even remember my wedding day. It was all a bit of a dream, or, you know, I was like just too caught up in something. So people get married usually for other people. It's what other people want. It's another one of those sort of projections. Funerals can be the same. I mean, sometimes funerals are like, you know, when people get up and, you know, my favorite funerals have been where people have been really brutally honest and going, yeah, you know, you could be a real asshole, but also this, you know what I mean, where you actually get honest appraisal of somebody's existence, you know, warts and all, and that I think is interesting. But I do think you're right. There's a deeper sense in which all of these things, which, you know, was it Rimbaud, or was it Rimbaud that said, you know, love needs to be reinvented? I think that wasn't that in the series of poems that he did about the reinvention of love, and I think that was connected to some statement about marriage. But
what's bringing me up is a part of your book which also stuck with me on love, where you say the problem is not that love is not enough, but that we are not ready for all that love entails. And I thought that was a super powerful one, that we're not, like, that narcissism in some sense is a defense against all that love would really entail.
Yeah, because I mean, I think this is why you know, you know, Alenka's book, What is Sex? But, you know, you could ask the same question of what is love? You know, you could, and this is why, to me, conversations about love that are conceptual or theoretical or ideological are really unhelpful, which is why really you have to go to the poets and the artists to understand anything about love. And you know, it's like that Paul McCartney song, you know, silly love songs. I want to fill the world with silly love songs, but really he doesn't want to fill the world with silly love songs. It's just that love songs are always marginally silly, because it's such a deep topic that we're almost too afraid to drill down into really what that means. It's like, I think it's I mean, arguably it's the core of the human is this call to love that we keep echoing over and over again, but it's a call that we answer but can't answer, in a sense, because it's beyond us, you know, or it's always a step further, that an invitation to dig deeper into this something that radically alters the way you are. And I don't mean just romantic love or sexual love, but I mean, you know, love for humanity, love for the other.
Yeah, I think it certainly resonates in regards to sort of, you know, love. You know, you say, what is sex? What is love? Is, you know, something that constantly decenters you, destroys you, could potentially destroy you.
Yeah.
Is something that maybe, again, when I bring back to themes like birth, marriage, funerals, there's to me something about the other where you're being decentered to the child, you're being decentered to your partner, you're being decentered to sort of the abyss of now what do we do that person's gone. But something there maybe.
And yeah, and also I think those are all those things you mentioned, they're sort of moments of transcendence. There's a interesting book by this anthropologist named David Chichester called Patterns of Transcendence, and it's a book where he studies death rituals around the world, and sort of talks about the different ways that people deal with death. You know, the rituals around death, whether someone's buried, or you know, or they're cremated, or they're immolated, or they're chopped up and fed to the birds, like in, you know, in the Himalayas, you know, to the vultures, and sort of looks at the ways in which what he calls these different patterns of transcendent experience emerge through these death rituals, and I think you can extend that to things like, you know, birth, and the call to love, I think, is a call to a kind of experiential transcendence that's transgressive to it's a transgressive act for you or I to engage in love. Do you know what I mean? I think.
Well, I think it's back to sort of this maybe we could talk about law, desire, and love, and the relationship between prohibition, transgression, and love.
See, this is why you're good with Lacan, because you like all those mathematical things.
Yeah, it's just my head is just a series of mathemes, you know, just running.
You know, no.
No, it's yeah, no, I was actually thinking about some things related to what you were saying on love, and what Lacan said is in the clinic we're always talking about love, and we also can't say anything about love.
Yeah, and I mean, that sort of is my argument, you know, really with theology. We're always talking theology, and we can't ever talk theology.
Yeah, So again, there's a direct overlap there. There's so many interesting overlaps, of course, between theology, philosophy, and psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
Maybe towards the end of the conversation, we could bring up a little bit more your direct relationship to Christianity, which comes up, of course, in the religious section of the book. And maybe juxtapose it with sort of your experiences with the counterculture, and at the same time sort of trying to bring, I think, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but a type of more materialist form of Christianity. And specifically here, the jumping off point I'd like to give, in one part of the book, you talk about the biggest problem with Christians is that they're afraid of dirt, that the desire for purity puts a premium, or postures a distance from anything that could be contaminating the grime and the messiness of life.
Yeah. Well, because I mean, and really, I think I actually got that from Jesus, in the sense that when I was so, without getting like too deep in the weeds, I had a if you like, an encounter with the idea of religion outside of formal Christianity, which wound up in the end through a series of events, or a series of situations. I then found myself within the horizon of sort of institutional Christianity for a while. But within that, I also then started to come to terms with finding my own sort of voice within that horizon by doing by coming to terms with what I did and didn't want to address, you know, in my life with regard to religion. And the thing that really interested me, mostly, that because the thing that first interested me about Jesus, if you like, was the way in which his actions towards others were always in violation of the religious systems and taboos within which he found himself, and yet he regarded himself as a faithful upholder of that system. But you know, sort of first century Judaism was, like many religions, a religion based on purity. Don't touch the unclean thing, you know. And so many times, if you read through the Gospels, and you don't have to believe them, but if you just look at the stories, there is this constant breaking down of the purity code by Jesus's willingness to touch and be touched the unclean thing. And there's like this inversion that you don't find purity by removing yourself from all dirt. You actually find purity through the dirt. This is my whole thing about the mystical, magical mystery of living on the dust of this planet. You know, we live in a dirty world. And I mean, at one point I did give a series of talks called Shit, Piss, Fuck, Cum, which was about bodily fluids, because there's this really interesting notion. There's a statement. I don't know if this is getting too in the weeds, but I'll just say that in one of the Gospels, Jesus makes this statement to the Pharisees, who are one of his sort of protagonists in the Gospels, and he says, "Go and learn this. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And he seems to juxtapose a religion based on sacrifice, you know, what you give up and what you offer up, to this whole kind of religion of mercy. And I think what to me what that is a practice of breaking down all of the codes that are built around this idea of purity, and that you've got to get involved in the complexity and the messiness of life. You know, I mean, it's so funny if you think about it. We perform these, like you kiss somebody, which is it's an incredibly intimate thing. But there are so many in the people in the world that you'd be repelled by kissing. The idea of it is just repulsive because we have all of these kind of disgust mechanisms that come with purity. You know, when you commit to a sort of purity, don't touch this and don't touch that, it brings up that kind of disgust mechanism. And I think a religion of purity is a religion of disgust. We're disgusted by somebody's brokenness, by their profanity, by their sin, by their shame, by their dirt. You know, so you don't want to touch all the things that dirt you, but there's something about the mess of life, I think, that is where you sort of find the treasures. I don't know. I sort of lost my train of thought there a little bit, but
no, I love what you're saying, and I can sort of bring it back around. I mean, especially I have the same sort of, well, I thought it was beautiful the way you were describing the relationship between Jesus and the system, and sort of the way in which, yeah, I mean, Jesus, in terms of many of the stories, he's like he's with the sinners, he's with the prostitutes, he's in some sense in the dirt and the messiness of life. Did I think I lost you there for a sec? There you are.
You did.
So just that Jesus is with the sinners, he's with the prostitutes, and at the same time as a you know, is upholding a certain system of values.
Yeah.
But just, you know, I also wanted to touch a little bit. I thought it was interesting, your presentation there on bodily fluids as well is very interesting. But also I wanted to touch on, you know, you say in the book about the only thing perhaps being more intimate and vulnerable than kissing as sex. But I wonder if kissing is even more vulnerable in some sense. In that a lot of people say kissing is more vulnerable because, like, for example, even you say there are prostitutes who will have sex with people, but they won't kiss.
Yeah. Oh no.
The people.
I mean, it's really, yeah. It's interesting in that. That's why, I mean, I think I wrote a little chapter in there on the theology of kissing, because
Yeah, and the theology of breath and connecting it to the breath.
yeah, and I do think that there, you know, that exchange, you know, that exchange of saliva, you know, the mouth, you know, because you know, we spit, and that's disgusting, and we kiss someone that we love, and that isn't. But it's the same thing. You know, it's the same fluid, if you like. You know what I mean? And so one has disgust attached to it, and one has intimacy attached to it. And what I thought was interesting is, it's why, you know, I always remember, you know, there's that sort of story about Princess Diana, you know, holding hands with an AIDS patient very early on in the HIV era when she was around, and everybody sort of commending her for her compassion and stuff like that, you know, which is in a sense the sort of self same thing that Jesus did, or, you know, people do throughout the ages. You know, it's why we're so sort of humbled by people that nurse the sick and wash people's wounds, and, you know, Mother Teresa or whomever that takes the time to attend to the sores of the world. In that we see something of grace and beauty, and there's something majestic, there's something profound about the willingness of someone to get enmeshed in somebody else's dirt, whether it's the dirt of their pain or the open sores of a wound. You know, I think of all the doctors in Gaza right now, you know, who are doing what they do, and at their own expense, you know, just in that stuff of life. And to me, that's where you have to bury that's where you have to bury your or that's where you have to sort of raise your religious flag, if you like, I think. So that's, for me, is in the material existence of life. So rather than demanding that people be pure, you meet people in their dirt, if you like, and walk with them, attending to their dust.
I mean, I want to sort of ask if it's connected to how you define radical theology towards the end of the book. This sort of, you know, the theology of sort of the, let's say, the material of getting in the dirt, getting your hands dirty, walking with people where they're wounded, where they're sore. You define radical theology as the environment in which the alternative becomes thinkable.
Yeah.
I was wondering, you know, how we might be able to connect this definition with what you're talking about, with the sort of walking in the dirt, so to speak, in the messiness of life.
Yeah, I mean, because to me, you know, radical theology, and you know, I mean, my thoughts about radical theology are changing all the time, because, you know, it's an idea, and I think you discover, you sort of fine tune ideas over a while, but ultimately, I it sort of stands in opposition or over against, if you like, a kind of confessional Christianity, you know, built around creeds and stuff like that. And the very notion of the radical is that you're digging down, you're drilling down into what's beneath that, you know. So the sort of theologian philosopher John Caputo says, you know, it's what's going on inside the name of God that's the interesting thing. That's sort of where radical theology sort of what's going on, you know. It's like what's going on inside in desire, you know, what, drilling down into that, not going, oh yeah, this is what desire means, let me prescribe it for you, let me describe its contours and its limits. Radical theology would sort of want to drill down into that and go, what's going on in desire, what's going on with desire, and so what's going on within belief or faith, what's going on in the name of God, what's really lurking there, you know. When people say they believe something, is it that they actually are voicing what they don't really believe, that what they want to believe? Are they voicing a desire or a wish fulfillment? You know, it's Freud's thing, it's a wish fulfillment, you know. Or are they voicing an anxiety, you know? So I think radical theology, which is why I think radical theology and, you know, continental philosophy and psychoanalysis work well together, because for me, what one of the things about radical theology is it taps into another interest of mine, which is, what do you do with all the things that don't fit? You know, the swerves that come along and they don't fit your criteria and they don't fit your jigsaw puzzle or your schema or your graph or your map. They're within everything. There's always stuff that doesn't fit, and the general tendency is to try and squeeze it in, you know. So you have a religion where you say, you know, well, God will heal you, but then somebody doesn't get healed, and so, well, it can't be God's problem, it has to be their problem, so they have a lack of faith. Well, radical theology might sort of ask, what's going on in the name of the God who heals and the one who supposedly lacks faith, you know, and what's the alternative world that can be crafted through that?
I definitely love playing at the edges of all of these things: radical theology, continental philosophy, and psychoanalysis. I do think they can fit well together. And I think in regards to your last thought there, or your last reflection there on what does not fit, I think that kind of brings again our conversation back to some sort of relationship in regards to where we started with the overarching narratives and the way life comes to us in these, in
Yeah,
basically the places that don't fit.
yeah, and I think the other thing, for me, with, if I was going to sort of describe my own sort of theological thing, is there are no questions that aren't interesting, and there is no subject that you can't talk about, and you don't have to have an answer for any of them, because I'm not so sure that, it's it's the working out, maybe what the answer might be, and it may not be the answer that you think it is, but also the open-endedness of just asking the question again, the interrogation of the thing over and over, that sort of Kristeva approach where you're going to interrogate and ask the questions again of the thing that actually, those recurring themes in life. You read that book, This Incredible Need to Know, by Julia Kristeva. So that's a fascinating book for anybody interested in reading, I think.
I'm gonna have to put it on my list.
Incredible Need to Believe, sorry. It's and she sort of has this thing, the need to believe and the desire to know, and the tension between the two that we live with in the 21st century. It's kind of an interesting way of thinking about how our kind of secularized world that needs to know deals with the perennial age-old questions of what is this life and what is it to live, and the tensions that come from living those questions.
I think it's absolutely central in terms of a lot of the conversations and themes that have been running around not only what Philosophy Portal's been doing, but other sort of organizations. I feel like it under the same sort of with a similar mission is sort of trying to rekindle the art of living. And what does it really mean to live? What does it really mean to cultivate a knowledge which is in service of the real, of the mystery of existence, life and death, and all of the things that we've been talking about today. But in the same way that I want to add Kristeva's book to my list, I want to encourage everyone to add your book to their list of things to read, Sex, God, and Rock and Roll. I thought it was an incredibly enjoyable read, very accessible, and very personal in a way that does not sacrifice any engagement with radical theology, philosophy, and deep engagements at the intersection, I think, of, say, art, religion, and philosophy. They're all intermingled in there, and in a way that's sort of true to your life history, which I found enjoyable. Is there any sort of last thought you would want to leave to our viewers in regards to the book, or also your ongoing work?
I don't know, really. I mean, I I tried to sort of put out something that was both personal, but without, creating some pure biography. But really, I was just trying to talk about life in a way that I think might give people space and an awareness that it's okay to, I don't know, just to work out what your own questions and interests in life are, and to chase those, and not get so caught up in the tyranny of everybody else's notions for yourself. But yeah, I don't know. I'm happy that you liked it. I'm actually humbled that you did. I think it's because you know your shit. So if you're interested,
Well, maybe the better question is what's your where do you think your work is heading with radical theology, and what should we look out for?
well, I've been doing a lot of thinking in the last few years on two fronts, really. The sort of continuing exploration of you know, what is the human and what does it mean to what is the art of living, and how might we deal with, you know, life after lack, which is how I've been terming it of late, you know, sort of living.
That's a great question.
Yeah, how do we live? So I don't really believe that life has meaning, but I do believe that you can make a meaningful life, and so life after lack to me is a thing, and I've been particularly interested in the impact of digitality on life, and particularly on the world of religion, but also, I mean, I don't think that there's any realm really. I mean, I think philosophy is really being challenged by digitality, the way in which our self-understanding and is being reshaped by a new communication technology, because that always affects the way we think about what it means to have consciousness and understanding, and it always changes how you think about God, I think, you know. It's like that McLuhan thing, you know, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. And, you know, there's that back and forth, and we never know what we've made. And we never know what we've made will allow us to discover about ourselves, but also will inhibit about ourselves. So I've been really fascinated with sort of the theo-digital world.
Exceptionally important topic. So maybe we'll have a chance to have another conversation, maybe along those lines in the future.
I'd love to.
I know it's certainly something that's on the frontier of my mind as well. So I guess with that being said, I will encourage everyone watching and with us to check out Barry Taylor's book. The link will be in the description, as well as links to his GCAS site and other links where you can find out more about his work. Here, I just want to thank you for watching and have a great evening.
Thanks, Kunal. Great to see you.